Who was here?
Well, a seven-member congressional delegation from the US, led by Representative Michael McCaul, the head of the House Foreign Relations Committee, and Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker Emerita of the House.
To meet whom?
To meet the Dalai Lama in Dharamshala, which is extremely important because it's not very often that delegations of this level go all the way to Dharamshala to meet the Dalai Lama.
And what were they here for?
Well, they were here because they want to emphasize US policy on Tibet, which is undergoing a slight progression. In fact, a significant progression from its earlier policy because of a bill that is being passed by the two houses of the US Congress. It's called the Resolve Tibet Act.
So why now?
The relations between US and China are on a downturn. China has been extremely aggressive in South China Sea and against Taiwan. In US-China relations also things have been tense. So I suppose the US wants to open another front.
How do you expect China's going to react to this?
China has already reacted very angrily. In fact, Senator McCaul said that they had received a message from China not to come to India.
And how do you think this is going to impact India-China relations?
India-China relations are already not too good a state ever since Galwan. But now things are going to get even more difficult because India made its position also quite clear by the delegation being received by the Prime Minister on its way back.
And Ambassador Sinha, why are you here?
Yes. This book, I've been working on it for quite some time, but it's a very happy coincidence that its release is coinciding with the American Act and the visit of the delegation to Dharamshala.
Back in the day, every time Richard Gere waxed romantic in a movie, girls my age and women would lose their minds. They swooned over him. And the insecure man in me could never understand his charm. But that's a different story and for another day. However, there is a reason I mentioned it. As any boy in his teens would do, I assumed animosity. And as a nerd, decided to acquaint myself with the competition, the delusion. And so I did. A few pretty women later, I hadn't developed a better understanding of the original task. However, Gere's speech at the Oscars introduced me to yet another man, the Dalai Lama.
Where we could all kind of send love and truth and kind of sanity to Deng Xiaoping right now in Beijing, that he will take his troops and take the Chinese away from Tibet.
A man whose charm and appeal crossed borders. And this man's story did leave a mark on my memory. Forced to leave his homeland at 23 with 80,000 compatriots by China, he chose to settle down in India. Gere's Oscar speech is just one example what those born after 2000 need to understand is that throughout the later part of the 20th century, this man was everybody's favorite. He was tom-tommed by every major global political figure. From Clinton to Blair, you name it. Everybody wanted to show solidarity. Until the issue was put on the back burner as China grew and enmeshed itself in global trade, becoming indispensable for most nations. The cause of Tibet and its independence was forgotten. Some even distanced themselves. The Dalai Lama confined himself to Dharamsala. But now, the issue, the Tibetan cause, is at the forefront of global geopolitics once again. US recently passed a bill called the Resolve Tibet Bill to combat the Chinese propaganda around Tibet. The bill will soon become a law. Also, more importantly, a bipartisan congressional delegation led by Democrat former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Republican Michael McCaul was in India to meet the Dalai Lama. To talk about why now, why the world is once again showing solidarity with Tibetans, even at the cost of upsetting China, which it is by the way, I'm joined by India's former ambassador to Greece, also India's former permanent representative to the UN, head of India's UN affairs during the membership of the Security Council, Ambassador Dilip Sinha. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Abhishek.
So in politics and geopolitics, issues are never really dead. Even if they're dead, they're not really buried. Even if they're buried, the skeleton at least is preserved. Tibet is back and everybody's talking about it. Do tell us, why now?
Well, the current upsurge in the attention to Tibet is because of the visit of Representative McCall and Nancy Pelosi to the Dharamshala. It is also there in the news because the US Congress, as you mentioned, has passed these bills, which will soon become an act when President Biden signs it. And the Dalai Lama is currently in the US. The timing is very interesting. The delegation could have met the Dalai Lama in the US itself, but it wanted to make a point by visiting him in Dharamshala just a few days before he left for the US to send a message across to the world, and particularly to China, that the US stands by the people of Tibet. And that message going out from Indian soil also puts a bit of onus on India to start looking at its Tibet policy. And India did send a small message, which is the Prime Minister received the delegation in Delhi, as did the External Affairs Minister. So China's reaction was as hostile to the US as it was to India.
Yeah, we will talk about that reaction. But at this point in time, what's also interesting is that, as I mentioned earlier as well, that there was a bit of a lull. I mean, there was a period of 10, 15 years when Tibet, perhaps even more, when Tibet was not really at the forefront like it used to be. I mean, leaders from across the world wanted to be seen with the Dalai Lama, wanted to express their solidarity with him and the Tibetan cause. But then all of a sudden, the issue sort of, was put on back burner. The timing, do you think, is also important from the point of view of the fact that US and India want to check China's growth, want to check what it's doing in South China Sea, with Taiwan, etc.?
Well, yes, big powers play big games, and that's what this book is all about.
Yes.
That when big powers follow their policies, they follow their geopolitical interests, and when they do that, smaller countries often get the wrong end of the stick. Tibet is one such example which I have taken up in this book. And this has been important for India because it impacts India's security. Now, the US policy has gone through different phases. You mentioned about the phase when Tibet was forgotten. And in that phase, it is important that people like Richard Gere and other people that you have mentioned kept the interest in the issue alive because of their spiritual interest in the Dalai Lama. And so the Tibetan cause has had both the spiritual side and the political side. The political side at times getting forgotten because of geopolitics of the big powers, but the spiritual side was kept alive by people like Richard Gere, and he continues to campaign for it. What has happened in the recent past, because of which Tibet has now come into the geopolitics of America in particular, is the downslide in the relations between China and the US. And China has been threatening all kinds of countries, smaller countries along its eastern coast. And there are other disputes between China and the US over trade, intellectual right property, technology piracy, and a host of other issues, because of which the US feels that it must ratchet up the pressure on China.
Right.
And Tibet is one such point. Recently, earlier this year, when the Universal Periodic Review of China took place in the Human Rights Council, America was one of the 24 countries that raised the concerns of human rights in Tibet. But the new bill that is there on the anvil in the US goes a step further.
In fact, let's talk about the bill right now because it raises two key points. It addresses two key issues. One is, of course, that it asks Beijing to start conversations with the Dalai Lama once again to discuss the status of Tibet and the future. And so if you can elaborate a little bit about that bill and why that bill is so important.
You see, if you look at the major bills that the US has passed on its Tibet policy, the first came in George Bush's term in 2002. It was called the Tibet Policy Act.
Yeah.
That was a very mild kind of a act where it talked about protecting Tibet's water security, Tibet's environment. It talked about America giving assistance to Tibetan refugees, and then it mildly urged China to keep engaging with the Dalai Lama. Then came the 2020 Tibet Policy and Support Act, which went a few steps further and talked about Tibet with greater firmness. But this time, this particular act has raised two particularly important points. One is the definition of the territory of Tibet, and the second is the international status of Tibet. On the territory, as you know, China calls the province of Tibet, it calls it Xinjiang, but we'll call it Tibetan Autonomous Region.
Yeah.
A large part of Tibetan areas have been taken away and merged with 4 provinces of China.
Yes.
This is mentioned in the act, that when it talks about Tibet, it talks not only about the Tibetan Autonomous Region, but also about the Tibetan areas in those 4 provinces of China.
Yes, because the combined area of those provinces is, I think, about 2.5 million square kilometers, and the other one is half of it, 1.2 million.
Exactly. So you see, you have China has taken away half of Tibet and merged it in its own provinces. The other is the international status of Tibet. Now, if you ask anybody today, what is international status of Tibet, they will say, look, it is a gone case, it's a part of China, because nobody in the world recognizes the Tibetan government in exile in Dharamshala as a government in exile. But the US bill says that the status of Tibet is going to be is still disputed between China and India, so China and Tibet. And it is the status will be decided under international law.
Right.
Which means that it is not a closed chapter. The status of Tibet is still an open question, and this will be put on the international agenda if countries start pursuing it. So the point that you mentioned about David Miliband conceding in 2008, it was that said that, you know, we recognize Tibet as a part of China. That fiction needs to be reopened.
At this point, what the bill does, it also talks about putting money. I mean, there is also a financial aspect, because the US is now intending to actively combat Chinese propaganda around Tibet. If you could throw some light on that aspect of the bill.
Yes, that is another important aspect of the bill that you have pointed out, which is that China has been talking about Tibet being a part of China since ancient times.
Right.
And it has also been destroying Tibetan culture and spreading all kinds of canard about Tibetan religion. Now, the US says that this kind of disinformation has to be countered, and China must not indulge in such propaganda. So this is very important that a country like the US has spoken up for Tibetan culture, Tibetan history, because anybody who goes through Tibetan history, and I would recommend that people go through this book to understand relations between Tibet and China, going back several centuries, to explain.
You know, an interesting point in the book is that, one of the important aspects of China's strategies is to sort of, go in somewhere, create an issue where none exists, source it back to Qing dynasty, Ming dynasty, find some Chinese names and some old maps, and create a dispute where none exists, which is what it did with Tibet, which is what it is doing with India in case of Arunachal Pradesh. Of course, there are other countries as well, East Turkestan. And what you have done in your book is you have decided to, very consciously so, refer to, walk away from Sinicization, what China does with names. Talk to us about that a bit in terms of China's strategy.
Well, China rewrites history all the time. It is still rewriting history. Even as recent events like Tiananmen Square incident that took place about 30-40 years ago, all these things have been constantly rewritten in China. And China uses all kinds of signification strategies, not only of names, but there are mosques in China which have been reconstructed according to Chinese style of construction.
In Xinjiang region.
Also in Yunnan.
Right.
There's a recent mosque just been inaugurated, where in Yunnan, which is the province where the second largest Muslim population lives in China. So China does this all the time. And China also expropriates the history of other countries. For example, Genghis Khan.
Yes.
Now, everybody knows that he was a Mongol and he built one of the biggest empires known to human history. China claims that he is Chinese. So if I wouldn't be surprised tomorrow China claims all the territory, the entire Mongol empire all the way up to Hungary.
Right.
Because they say he was Chinese. Kublai Khan, another Mongol, claimed to be Chinese. So the Manchus themselves, now you have the Manchus came from north of China. Manchuria now of course is a part of China. But there was a time when it wasn't a part of China. It was north of the Great Wall that China built to protect itself from the various tribes that lived in the steppes. Now the Manchus were considered to be foreigners even by a person like Sun Yat-sen, who was the leader of the Chinese Revolution. And he wrote in his book that these are foreigners and we have suffered under them. And when the Chinese Revolution took place in 1911 and the Qing dynasty abdicated, there was a massive genocide of Manchus in China. And yet today, Communist China claims that all the territories conquered by the Manchus is the historical heritage of China. And then it gives them Chinese names, like East Turkestan is now called Xinjiang, which means new province, and Tibet's name has also been changed to Xizang. Now Xizang can mean anything, Western Tsang, or Tsang is one of the provinces in Tibet.
Right.
They have taken that, sinicized the name, put Shi to it, and then it becomes Xizang. And Arunachal Pradesh, which has never ever in history been part of China. I don't think any Chinese force has ever entered any part of Arunachal Pradesh. They call it Zhangnan, which means South Tibet. So there you are, you have Chinese constantly rewriting history or history with Chinese characteristics.
Now the name of the book is Imperial Games. Of course, the imperial powers you're referring to include Britain, Russia and China. However, Russia and Britain are looked at, recognized as imperial powers. But what often is not discussed is the fact that Chinese have been very shrewd in terms of their imperial ambitions and are not referred to as such a power.
Yes, China has very cleverly projected itself as a victim of imperialism.
Right.
Whereas China in reality was an imperial power itself. In fact, in Central Asia, China was the first of the three powers that you have mentioned to enter. It entered in about 1720, it captured Tibet. Another 30 years later, it captured northern Xinjiang or East Turkestan, which was called Zangaria at that time. It was populated by Mongols. And then southern part, which is called Kashgaria, and that was populated by Uyghurs. And that they conquered as late as in 1759. And within about 60-70 years, there was a revolt there, and the Chinese were driven out. And then China went back with the help of the British, because Chinese empire had started collapsing after the first Opium War. And it was Britain and to a great extent Russia that helped China rebuild itself. And the Chinese empire was reconstructed with European help. They were the ones who helped them to come to Xinjiang. And in Tibet also, it was Britain that constantly promoted Chinese interests. You know, when transport improved between Hong Kong and Kolkata, first because of sea routes and second because of flights, the fastest route from China to Lhasa was through India.
Right.
And the British helped the Chinese go through. The Chinese of course keep saying that Britain was playing games, but the fact is that Britain was playing games, but the games were to help China. And many of the treaties that these countries signed amongst themselves refer to China as the Chinese empire. So China was quite willing to call itself an empire in the Manchu period, but now of course they downplay this term empire and they call themselves a multinational state.
You know, China, another thing it does very well is the way it positions itself. We will talk about how it's positioned itself in the global geopolitics right now a little later. But you were of course talking about how China's growth in the 20th century, early part of 20th century was sort of, it was helped by Britain, it was also helped by Russia. Tell us a little bit about how China managed to do it.
Well, China has been very certain about its destiny, of what it wants to achieve. And the Chinese negotiating tactics are that when you are weak, you should stay back, not negotiate. If you are forced to negotiate, don't sign anything. Otherwise, you lose territory. And I have mentioned incidents in the book where a Chinese ambassador who had signed an unpopular treaty was threatened with capital punishment. And it were the Russians who and Britain who rescued him.
And I think they called it something like unequal
treaty. So if a treaty by mistake has been signed or under pressure, they declare it to be an unequal treaty, and they denounce it and they go back on it. So this happens all the time. And then they keep a very long-term perspective in mind. That 10, 15, 20 years is not a very important point. The other is that they don't mind taking help from other countries. Now, when Mao Zedong first came to power, he spent 2 months in Moscow, soon after coming to power, where he got his entire policies endorsed by Stalin and took his support. So when China attacked Tibet, Russia supported it with weapons and with advice. The first road that was built from Xinjiang to Tibet across what is called the occupied area of Aksai Chin. This was a new road because the old road from East Turkestan to Tibet used to go through Ladakh. That's the route that traders used to take. But since that portion was under Indian control, China wanted a new road, and Russian engineers helped China in doing this. Later, when China and Russia developed differences, China decided to look for help elsewhere, and it happily turned towards the US, where Nixon and Kissinger decided that China could be a pawn to be played against the Soviet Union. And China didn't mind that at all. China happily took all the assistance that America could give. China stole, China sent its students to America, scientists to America. So it worked very hard. One must give them credit for that. Chinese people worked very hard to build the economy of China, build its military strength. And during this period, it followed a policy of conciliation with all countries, including India. So Deng Xiaoping, for example, happily welcomed Rajiv Gandhi, then Narasimha Rao. So all these things, China was ensured that it wanted to build its economy, its military strength. This was a time to be friendly with other countries. And then once it had that strength, then it decided that it must spread its wings. And it started by threatening Taiwan, South China Sea, and a host of other areas.
I mean, it spread its wings so much that nearly 60% of China's entire area is comprised of other countries. Manchuria, Mongolia, East Turkestan, Tibet, and whatever remains is the actual China. So, and now of course it has ambitions as far as Taiwan is concerned. Of course, it's very well known, South China Sea, with India, of course, Arunachal Pradesh. My question is, what's China's place in this modern world where somewhere or the other China is always causing trouble?
Well, China has very successfully managed to take advantage of accidents of history which enabled the Republic of China to become a permanent member of the Security Council. But thereafter, it very cleverly managed to get Republic of China replaced by the People's Republic of China in the Security Council. So now it is a permanent member of the Security Council, which means it has a veto power. So it doesn't need to worry about the Security Council, and it has taken full advantage of its position in the UN to dominate various international organizations. There was a time about 4 or 5 years ago when Chinese nationals headed 4 of the 15 specialized agencies of the UN. It will be difficult to think of an Indian having headed one of the specialized agencies for a long time. So China has played that very carefully, and China has also ensured that its position as a veto wielding power is used to help countries that need its help, dictatorial countries in particular, countries which have been trying to improve relations with Taiwan. They are threatened by China. And China has also arbitrarily decided to extend its borders. For example, the South China Sea, where it put in the 11 dashed line, then it moved 2 dashes, made it the 9 dashed line. And when the Philippines asked China to take the matter under UNCLOS, the law of the seas, to arbitration, China refused. The arbitration award was given in favor of the Philippines. China refused to accept it. So here you have a permanent member of the Security Council which is not prepared to accept elementary procedures laid down under international law to resolve disputes. And threatening another country is against the UN Charter. It's one of the first principles of the UN Charter that no country shall invade another country or threaten another country with the use of force. And China is doing all the time with Taiwan. Even if it claims Taiwan as part of its territory, it has no business in threatening it or invading it. There are other non-violent ways of resolving such disputes, but China doesn't believe in them.
Yeah, but China is also very good at, it necessarily does not go for outright conquest, even in case of Tibet. It went to Chamdo and the Tibetans could not fight the Chinese. It won that particular place, very small city, town, whatever you want to call it, and then went back. And of course, after that, a delegation of the Tibetans went to Beijing, 17-point agreement was signed. There is the show of might that China does, and it does very well, whether it's South China Sea or the Himalayas. But when it comes down to it, it is also very shrewd about not fighting a war, but winning territory.
Well, yes, what you say about China being very shrewd is absolutely correct. When they invaded Tibet, for example, they were unsure about marching into Lhasa.
Yeah.
So they stopped at Chamdo and they negotiated.
Yeah.
And when they found that Tibet had no support, they eventually compelled the Tibetan representative to sign the 17-point agreement. And of course, they made all kinds of promises that will respect the Tibetan institutions, the Dalai Lama, Tibetan autonomy. And the Tibetans were taken in by all these promises. And eventually, they then, after Tibet had signed the agreement,
backtracked.
They marched into Lhasa. And then within a few years, they backtracked on all the agreements and launched a massive repression in Tibet. So they do have this policy of putting incremental pressure, ratcheting up pressure with both military threats, and they play upon the opponent's fears of getting into a war. So they, by threatening, they hope that the other side will succumb somehow and accept some peace terms. But at the same time, China has also been not averse entirely to fighting a war. For example, in the Korean War, yes. They pushed back General
MacArthur.
MacArthur.
That being the only exception.
That is true. That's an exception. But it was a massive amount of force in which they suffered massively. But the PLA was not concerned about how many losses it suffered. It just went ahead and pushed General MacArthur back. So yes, there is a certain shrewdness about it, certain unwillingness to take too many losses. But at the same time, when it comes to the crunch, it is quite capable of taking those decisions.
All right. Now, going back to the congressional visit, one point in your book which emerges very strongly is that Tibet, over the years, has been used as a pawn. Would you say that even now, it's because, of course, the US wants to put more pressure on China? It is because, of course, India also has a conflict with China, that Tibet is perhaps again being used as a pawn?
Well, I would say that what happens is that the big powers have large geopolitical interests. So they strike deals based upon their geopolitical interests, in which the interests of the smaller countries might get sacrificed. So as you would say in a chess game, you can sacrifice a pawn. So if you have a country like small country that gets sacrificed in the process, as happened between Britain and Russia, where they sacrificed Tibet to China. In the case of the US also, that may well happen. But at the moment, the US is pursuing a policy that will help Tibet. So the Tibetans will naturally take it and take whatever help they are getting. And for India has to understand that in our relations with China, the border dispute really is a very minor part of the dispute. The main issue is Tibet, because the Tibetan people have not accepted Chinese rule. They are protesting both inside Tibet in a very peaceful, but there have been some self-immolations have taken place even recently.
Yes.
And they protest strongly outside, both in India and abroad. Now, every time Tibetans protest, China suspects that India is behind those protests. Right. And China accuses India also of being behind those. And given that position, we just have to accept that, realize that by giving asylum to the Dalai Lama and to the Tibetan refugees, we have already annoyed Tibet. And as long as these people remain here, as long as the Tibetans refuse to accept Chinese rule, China will be suspicious of India. So we have to recognize that Tibet is the bone of contention.
But until before the visit, at least we were not actively poking the Chinese. Tibetans were here, they have been here for decades, but we were not actively poking them by inviting the US, or rather letting them come into India, fly into India and then meet the Dalai Lama. Has India once again poked the dragon, so to speak?
Well, India is moving very, very carefully. Our relations with the US have improved considerably. Our relations with China, coincidentally, in the same period have gone down. We need friends and allies in dealing with China, and the US and the Quad is one such. There are other smaller countries also in Asia that face similar problem, and with whom again we are talking, discussing. But India, you're quite right in saying that we have not gone ahead and tried to poke the dragon, so to say. We have been very circumspect about it, but we have been compelled to move forward in this direction because what China did in Kalwan, for example, was atrocious. It violated even the most elementary agreement that we had with China, that our patrols would not carry weapons with them. And while there would be disputes, they would at least be civilized about it. Yeah. That compact was violated by China in Kalwan. And other areas like water security, where China had agreed that they would give data to us to help us deal with floods, especially in the northeast. Yeah. Now, China has gone back on that, stopped giving us hydrological data, when it shares that same data with Bangladesh but doesn't share with India. And it's one of the most elementary things that China can do. India had gone ahead and signed the Indus Waters Treaty with Pakistan way back and has been honoring that treaty. China has two of the rivers of the Indus waters, Indus itself and Satluj, start from Tibet. Yeah. But China does not even bother to ever offer to share or talk about it. We don't know what China is doing with the dams that it is building, and whether it will start diverting water from Tibet, the rivers that flow into India, into China, because China doesn't discuss these things. So we have all these things that are extremely important for our security, military security as well as water security, environmental security, because Tibet is the second or the third largest reservoir of fresh water in the world. Yes. So it is very important that we, whoever rules Tibet, has a friendly disposition towards India and treats India as a country with which they share a common border and share a common environment. But if China treats India as an enemy and refuses to share anything with it, then we have to start revisiting our policy.
What do you see happening in future between India and China, and then of course the conflict as it is happening right now between US and China? What's the future that you see for these two relationships?
Well, for US and China, I really cannot say, because it is for the US to decide what policy it wants to follow. China has various incentives inducements that it can offer to the US.
But do you see conflict increasing?
At the moment, if the two countries go the way they are going, yes, there is always a possibility of a conflict breaking out. You've already seen incidents taking place in the South China Sea between the Philippines and China. In Taiwan, it's just a trigger away from conflagration. So yes, while the big powers, China and the US, may not want a war at the moment, there is always the possibility of a small incident triggering and escalating a conflict, as happened in the case of the First World War, where there was a series of network of alliances which compelled countries to move into, take positions and start war because of a small incident that took place in Austria-Hungary. Right. Now, here again a similar situation may arise, but right now I think things are under control. But both sides are trying to gain advantageous positions so that yes, as and when the conflict breaks out, they are in a position to take advantage of it. In the case of India and China, things are a little more difficult because let's say on the trade front, China's exports to India are increasing, and yet our exports to China are falling because China has a very strict policy about what it imports from India. So while China has become India's largest trading partner last year, the trade is extremely one-sided. Now, you can't have a trade that's as one-sided as this and still continue to have regular trade relations with China. After all, we have to earn the hard currency somewhere else to pay China for the imports. And then you have the border incidents that keep taking place, the amount of money that we have to spend on our defense, because our part of the border, because of the Himalayas, which is a very fragile mountain, is extremely difficult to build infrastructure there. China has a certain advantage over there. So we have to look at all this and start framing our policy, looking at the long term to see what is in our interest in the long term.
But do you think, let China continue to rise the way it's been rising, that it's going to be difficult to deal with China in future?
Well, if China's aggressive policies continue, yes, it will be difficult to deal with China. Quad incidentally is not an alliance as such, right. It's more of a place where you coordinate your policies, and I hope that becomes stronger, the coordination.
Do you think that should have been the case, that Quad should have been an alliance of some sort?
Well, it should certainly have an alliance structure. Is very important, because what is important when you deal with an aggressive power is that it must be clear that if it starts war, then there is an alliance that'll check it, and it'll be confronted with a very strong enemy. Okay. Now, if that message goes clearly to the aggressive country, then it will think twice before taking on a small country like Taiwan, for example, or Philippines. That if I do this, then it will trigger a major war. So it is important to send clear messages through alliance structures. One of the reasons why, for example, during the Cold War, no war broke out was because both sides realized that there was a two-way alliance structure. There was NATO and there was the Warsaw Pact. And any miscalculation would lead to a nuclear war. So both sides were very cautious in playing their game. But that's the same thing that needs to be done here, that China should not think that, there's one island here, I can take it without conflagrating a major war. That should not be the case, because that will mean that there will actually be a risk of a war breaking out.
Right. Now, the reason I picked up the book is because, the lazy man's way of reading a book is you sort of, and I wasn't being lazy, frankly and honestly, and I did want to read the entire book, but I've only had it for so much time, I went to the epilogue. And the thing which stood out is the fact that there is no end game in sight as far as Tibet is concerned, which is what I'm going back to. So in that case, what should the Tibetans do? Because, of course, the 14th Dalai Lama is very old. China actively wants to interfere in the process of selection of the 15th Dalai Lama. So keeping all that in mind, what should the Tibetans do at this point in time?
Well, the Dalai Lama has already divested himself of all temporal powers. So all political issues are handled by the Central Tibetan Administration, which is the government in exile in Dharamshala. So he is now essentially the spiritual leader and a venerable figure, not only for the Tibetans but for the whole world. Now, this means that the Tibetans have a structure in place which will keep alive their resistance abroad, and inside Tibet the people cling to their religious beliefs, their culture, despite the harsh repression that they are facing. And that is the main strength of the Tibetan people and their resistance, that it has to be non-violent and it has to continue through the stoic resistance that the people of Tibet have. In this process, they also have to try and get international support, which they are doing, for example, by these visits of these delegations. Tibet has to continue to garner international support, put forward their cause, get support, whether it is on account of human rights, on account of cultural rights, or account if they possibly can get other countries to recognize their right of self-determination, which again is there in the UN Charter.
Yes.
So this is the only thing that the Tibetan people can do at the moment, and then hope that at some point in time better sense will prevail in China, or the geopolitical situation would change in such a way that it becomes favorable. After all, 70 years is not a very long period of time in the history of a nation. Yeah. Countries have been under foreign rule for longer periods of time. Yes. India was for 150 years, and yet we became independent. So one hopes that while at the moment there is no end game in sight. In due course, the clouds will.
I mean, interestingly, you mentioned in the book that had Tibet been conquered by Britain or Russia, it would have been a free country by now. But it's been a victim of misfortune and miscalculation, that it was in fact conquered by China, which is refusing to, of course, let the Tibetans be. But it was a great conversation, Ambassador Sinha. Thank you so much for talking to us. But before we let you go, would you like to tell our viewers why should they read the book? Please.
Well, I think readers should read this book because it is important that we know about Tibet. Tibet is India's largest neighbor. It is also India's closest neighbor. And India's border with Tibet has always been, historically been, the most peaceful border. Very few armies have actually crossed this border to invade the other country. There have been incidents where Indian forces went and Tibetan forces came, but very few in our long history. And what binds India and Tibet together is culture, history, and of course Buddhism, the great religion of Lord Buddha. So it is important whether Tibet is under China or independent is not the issue. It is important for us to know about our neighbor and a country that looks upon India as the land of the gods.
Great note to end this interview on. Thank you so much for taking out the time and talking to us, Ambassador Sinha. Thank you.
Thank you.